are so delighted to have one of the treasures of Hamilton right here volunteering his time. Like you, he could be anywhere on this gorgeous autumnal evening, but he chose to be here to share his story and have a conversation and address your questions and answers about his work. As many of you know, Nelson Johnson is the author of 2 books on the history of Atlantic City, Boardwalk Empire, which of course has been turned into the hit HBO series, and of course The North Side, another very important piece of work which examines the African American experience in the resort town of Atlantic City. So as I said, the format this evening will be a conversation. I'm going to start out asking some questions just to get the backstory, and then we invite you to either use the index cards and pass them forward, or stand up and be heard and ask your question. So without further ado, we welcome you to Kramer Hall. I forgot to tell them about the cell phones.
Okay.
Please take a moment and don't embarrass yourself and turn off your cell phones or anything else that makes noise on your possession. Excuse me.
Thank you. I am delighted to be here. A little overwhelming. It's wonderful to see this space filled in this fashion. I was in this space many times when I was a young person. Anna Bertino owned this building, and she was a neat lady. One of the toughest, smartest, most aggressive people I ever met. And I'm not saying woman I ever met, but she was an extraordinary person, the lady that owned this building. Let's begin with your questions, because you have a good list.
Okay, so we were interested in the backstory of how a Hamilton resident became so interested in researching and writing on the topic of Atlantic City.
In 1980, I was asked to represent the Atlantic City Planning Board, and it was at the beginning of the boom of construction in Atlantic City after the referendum in '76, and I was thrilled to have the opportunity. It was a real challenge. And I went into City Hall knowing that the place was corrupt. And I knew I was going to be able to deal with that. But what I did not bargain for was how dysfunctional City Hall was. And the more I was there, I kept saying to myself, why is this place so screwed up? Why can't they get anything done? This is not making sense to me, that they're just this unable to really get things done. So I am by nature a geek or a nerd or a bookworm, and my instincts were go to the library. So I went to, I don't know if you're familiar with Stockton's campus in Atlantic City, their Carnegie Center. Well, that was the original Atlantic City Library. That was the original Carnegie building that Andrew Carnegie, who was a very wealthy man, built, I think, like 2,200 libraries with his money before he died. The best quote from him is anybody, and any man who dies wealthy should be ashamed. And he spent all his money building libraries before his death. So I went to the library, and I had the good fortune of meeting 2 ladies, a woman by the name of Marie Boyd and Jane Spittler. And I sat down with them, told them my dilemma, and said that, what can you give me to read to help me make sense of this place? Well, they fed me books for about 18 months, and when I got through, I had read about 25 books, and I came up with the following conclusions. 1, no one had ever written a complete history. My voice coming? It sounds like I'm I feel like I'm in a barrel. Yeah. Is it all right? Okay, I can deal with it as long as I don't want them to feel like they're in a barrel either.
So you barrel along.
Okay, I'll barrel right through. And first I said, nobody's ever written a complete history of this town. You had books in the Boardwalk, books in hotels, books in Atlantic City as a tryout town for Broadway, books on vaudeville, books on fire companies, books on hotels, books on the Miss America pageant, books on air shows. There's more books. Books on pageants of all sorts. Books on Atlantic City as a display town. It was an amazing place to display goods by manufacturers at the turn of the century because they were guaranteed a large audience during the summer months. So that impressed me, that nobody had written a book about Atlantic City's history from the founding to the contemporary. That impressed me. The second thing that impressed me was the organic nature of the corruption and the failure of anybody to really write about it honestly. When I say organic, the corruption of old Atlantic City was perfectly natural, and it was essential to the success of the town. The town would not have been successful without the corruption. And I'll backtrack and explain to you what I mean by that. In the very beginning of the book, I quote a gentleman who I became good friends with, a gentleman by the name of Murray Fredericks, who was sort of the consigliere to the organization during his prime. And Murray really knew where the bones were buried, and it took me about 7 or 8 requests to get him to talk to me. And then once he did talk, it was very slow and halting, but we finally, I mean, he had known me and we had been friendly as lawyers, and he was sort of a mentor on some issues, but he wasn't going to give up the goods, so to speak, without really being patient. And at one point, this was after about the 3rd or 4th session where he was talking to me, I pressed him for, why is this town so corrupt? And his response was, if the people who came to town had wanted Bible readings, we'd have given them that. But no one ever asked for Bible readings. They wanted booze, broads, and gambling, so that's what we gave them. Now, in order to provide booze, broads, and gambling, accommodations have to be made. The law has to be ignored. The law has to be bent. The law has to be put off to one side. So Atlantic City in its prime was a place where people could know that they could have a hell-raising good time without regards to whether or not somebody was going to be enforcing the law. So booze, broads, and gambling became the backbone of the economy. And if you think about it, you may or may not know from American history that Prohibition did not pop out of the ground like a mushroom. A whole lot of things happened before Prohibition, and one of those things, the Anti-Saloon League had attained a lot of success beginning in the 1880s, 1890s, right on up to Prohibition in 1920. They had many states adopt what's called bishop's laws. And bishop's law said you can't sell alcohol on Sunday. And that was pretty strongly enforced. And Atlantic City's response to that was, what do you mean, no booze on Sunday? That's our busiest day of the week. So Atlantic City ignored the law for a very long time prior to Prohibition. So when Prohibition rolls in, it's intellectually, morally, it's not a big deal to go from doing something illegal 1 day a week to doing it illegal 7 days a week. And you think it through, it really isn't. If you can get away with it for 20 years, 1 day a week, well, then why can't you get away with it, ad infinitum for 7 days a week? It really wasn't that big a deal. So the corrupt nature of the town and the organic nature of the corruption really did impress me. And then the third thing that impressed me was the indispensable, and I don't use that word lightly, the indispensable role of the African American community. If you remove the black experience from Atlantic City's history, the town does not come to exist. I don't know what you have. Do you have Brigantine? Do you have Long Beach Island? I'm not sure what you have, but you don't have Atlantic City. You don't have a resort that at the turn of the century was able to host, between the middle of May and the middle of September, was able to host regularly in excess of 1/3 people, 7 days a week. That's a big deal. Okay? You can't do that without many, many, many strong backs and busy hands and quick feet. And if you look at the hotel workforce there was a tremendous study done by during the Great Depression. Part of FDR's program was to hire not only people that built things, but artists and writers and historians, and he put them all to work because nobody had any money, and he put them all to work. And the Public Works Administration, PWA, the PWA hired historians, and all this stuff is in the Heston. Let's say stuff. All this valuable treasure trove is in the Heston Room and in the archives in Trenton. But if you look at their work, and if you look at how they correlated the censuses from, you can say safely 1880 to 1930, 95% of the hotel workforce was African American. And so, absolutely indispensable. So when I saw all that after reading about 25 books that Jane Spittler and Marie Boyd had given me, I said, you know, there's a book here. Somebody ought to write a book. And I had always wanted to write a book. The book that I wanted to write was the political philosophy of St. Augustine. And he was a very savvy politician. But I didn't know Latin well enough to do that. So I sort of gave up the hopes of doing that around age 25. And it was shortly thereafter that I got interested in Atlantic City.
Quite a dichotomy, I must say, in interest. Could you share with us how you came up with the title Boardwalk Empire?
We had a different title for a very long time. The different title for a very long time was Nuckys Town. And about 6 or 8 months before my book was due to be published, maybe even less, Grace D'Amato came out with a book. It's just sort of a memoir about her husband's career in the 500 Club, and Nucky was in the title, and it completely freaked me out. I said, you know, this is not going to work. I can't have 2 books out there with the name Nucky in the title. So myself, my publisher John Bryans, my dear friend Stephen Persky, my dear friend Ralph Palmieri, my wife, Jane Spittler was still alive, but she wasn't doing well. She was dying of cancer. We sort of brainstormed, and we came up with Boardwalk Empire.
So now your passion's been aligned, you've put away St. Augustine, and how did you go about actually authenticating and fact-finding to separate fact from fiction?
Well, early on in the process, particularly with the second book, but also with the first book, I recognized that my research was a race against death, because the really smart people who understood what was going on, they were dying, they were old. And so I had been elected to the Board of Freeholders in the 70s. Now you find that how old I really am. And I was one of 2 Democrats, and I recognized that I needed to make friends with everybody on the board if I was going to get anything done. So all these Republicans, I made friends with them, and great people, all of them. And I had the good fortune of making friends with Bill Ross, who was mayor of Margate for about 35 years and chairman clerk of the Board of Freeholders. So when the bug got to me that I really do need to write a book, and I had a lot of academic sort of research done. There's been a lot of good PhD dissertations written over the years too on Atlantic City, and they're tremendous in terms of steering you towards good stuff. But I recognized, you know, you really do need to talk to some people to confirm some of these things. So I went to Bill, and Bill made introductions for me. Otherwise, these people would never have spoken to me. And unfortunately, I did give Bill a copy of the book, but Bill died about a year ago from Alzheimer's. He had Alzheimer's when the book was published. I don't know if he, ever knew anything about what was in the book. But I did bounce a lot of ideas off him. He's the one that steered me to a lady by the name of Mary Ill, who was an absolute gold mine of information. And she would steer me to other people. And he was the one that steered me to, well, I won't say steered me to, because I knew he was there, but he wasn't returning my phone calls. He got Dick Jackson to return my phone calls. Dick Jackson was one of the Atlantic City 7 who went to jail in 1972. And one of the finest gentlemen I ever got to know once I got him to talk to me. In fact, he interviewed me 3 times over lunch before he would let me ask him questions. He wanted to know what I knew. And so once he was satisfied that I knew something, he said, okay, now that I can see you're serious about this, you can ask me questions. And then next time we met, I would ask him questions. Sometimes he even let me put a tape recorder on. Other times he wouldn't. But Dick, again, if you have somebody like Dick Jackson calling people and say, I want you to talk to this guy Nelson Johnson, they'll talk to you. So I would say the 2 people who were most essential in getting me 2 people that would talk would be Bill Ross and Dick Jackson. And Dick was just a wonderful human being.
Some of us attended a conversation last night with the Plantation Center CEO, who was explaining to us about you better watch who you're talking to because the Google glasses might be on. So I don't think you ran into that problem in your research.
Jeff Rosen's a brilliant guy.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting night.
Yes.
As is tonight. So how different or similar are the perceptions of people today about corruptions in their town compared to the blind eyes that people put to the problems of corruptions in Atlantic City during the era?
There wasn't any blind eye in Atlantic City during its prime. There was complicity of the entire community. And what I mean by that is, the best example I can give you, best illustration I can give you, is the FBI's report on the indictment and conviction of Nucky Johnson. Because if you read the report by a guy by the name of William Frank, he was an FBI agent and an attorney. If you read the report, he tells you that when they came to town, they were very confident that they would have no difficulty convicting Johnson and be out of town inside of a year. It took them 5 years. And it took them 5 years because nobody in the community would cooperate. It took them 5 years because people would rather go to jail than cooperate. People would perjure themselves. People would be in contempt of court when a judge was telling them, you know, I'm giving you immunity, you must talk, and they would still refuse to talk. So the report really gives you a feel for, and talking to the old timers really gives you a feel for the fact that first the Commodore, and then Nucky, and then Farley was a very different personality completely. But the organization, so to speak, was sort of like the unifying principle of the community. So everybody really bought into the corruption. There isn't too much doubt about that. In terms of today, we got a different world in terms of how the media can cast a spotlight on corruption. But what I see, and this is a very personal perspective, but if you think it through with you may agree. What I see is the potential, especially at the local level, and I'm not talking about Hamilton, I'm talking about communities generally, and particularly cities, medium-sized and large cities. I see the opportunity for corruption just unbounded. And why I say that is daily newspapers are dying. And if any of you read the Inquirer, ask yourself, would Vince Fumo have ever gone to jail if there was no Philadelphia Inquirer? He was so powerful that nobody wanted to go after him. And it took about 11 stories in the Inquirer before the U.S. Attorney's Office would go after him. So if you remove newspapers from our major cities, I think corruption is going to flourish like crazy because there's nobody watching.
So can you share or summarize some of the actual processes that you use to create your work, the work of this magnitude? I mean, there was certainly years of research. You want to hold off on that question?
No. And everything that I think I need to write about, it could be a legal opinion, it could be an essay, could be these two books, and the one I'm trying to finish up now. First thing I do is immerse myself and try to educate myself as best I can on the people who are the players in the story, on the era that they lived in, on the communities that they lived in, on the people that they were allied with and the people that they were opposed with, and make notes on those different characters and different things. And then the really hard part is creating an outline. It's very hard. But once you have the outline, then it's sort of like a roadmap as to where you're going. And I have talked to friends of mine who are novelists, and they say that they will go to the extreme of creating characters, who their parents were, where they went to school, what illnesses they had, where they were in the military, and it's pretty interesting. And I'm doing sort of the same thing, only I'm doing it with real people. So, but then documenting those things is terribly important.
Well, it's quite a journey. Was there anything that shocked or surprised you when you were in the middle of this research? I mean, was there a different path you wanted to go, or what kept you connected, or?
The biggest surprise or shock, and it still is when I look back on it, the transition from Nucky Johnson going to jail and Hap Farley becoming boss made absolutely no sense to me at all. And I kept looking at it and I kept saying, what the hell is this about? He was like, at best, he was third in line. So how did he become boss? Some people might say he was fourth in line, but how did he become boss? And again, this was sort of a shock. Gives you an idea of the guys. I did get to meet him, but I can't say I really got to know him. Let's backtrack a little bit. Johnson is under siege with the FBI. As they are refusing to go to town, because he's been investigated before, but they never got anywhere. As the FBI is not leaving town, and they're there for the duration, it's becoming obvious to his organization that he's eventually going to go away. And so Johnson starts letting go of the reins of power so that the organization goes on, and he picks two capable people. But neither one were people who wanted to be boss. They wanted to be the right-hand man, so to speak. And he picked a guy by the name of Jimmy Boyd, who was the librarian's husband. Okay, and she gave up nothing to me. Nothing at all. Some cutesy stories, but she would never tell me anything about Jimmy was dead by the time. Well, no, he wasn't dead, but he was on his way to dying. He struggled with cancer a lot of years. But Marie Boyd never gave me this much about Jimmy, and I gave up. You know, but she was very helpful in other ways. And Jimmy Boyd's responsibility was to macing is a term that political scientists use. Rice pudding is a term that they use in Jersey City. Ice money is a term that they use in Atlantic City. But Jimmy Boyd's responsibility was to make sure that everybody on the payroll kicked back a portion of their salary. It was also his responsibility to make sure that vendors kicked back a portion of their contract. Responsibility of lawyers to kick back a portion of whatever fees that they made and distribute them in the organization. So he was the political enforcer. The racketeer enforcer was a guy by the name of Herman Stumpy Orman, and I tried to get him to talk to me. I knew his lawyer very well, a fellow by the name of Manny Levin. And if anybody could have got him to talk, it was Manny. And Manny said, "Nelson, he's not going to talk to you. He's just not going to talk to you." His job was the brothels. His job was the gambling rooms, and his job was liquor licenses. And the most important aspect of his job was the police department. Because if you were going to work on the police, think of this, the last person you went to before being hired for the police department was Stumpy Orman, who had nothing at all to do with the city, you know, officially, but he was the person who had to approve you that you were the kind of quality person that they wanted on the police department. And so these two guys are looking for a boss. They're looking for someone who's going to take Johnson's place. And the obvious heir apparent was Thomas Taggart. Thomas Taggart was a graduate of Dickinson Law School. His father was a surgeon at the Atlantic City Hospital. His mother traced her roots to the Mayflower. He was a stone-cold, hard-working organization person and really worked hard for the Republican Party. He was already elected to the Assembly. Also serving in the Assembly with him was a very distinguished and capable lawyer by the name of Vincent Hahnemann, the bridge into Brigantine. That's named after Vincent Hahnemann. And he was very respected. So those two guys looked like one of them should have been boss to take Johnson's place. And then Farley becomes boss. If you look at Farley's career, for the first 10 years out of law school, he did not have a law practice. He hung his license in Stumpy Orman's real estate office, but that wasn't enough to make him boss. That was help, but that wasn't enough to make him boss. He hung his license in Stumpy Orman's real estate office, and he met people there. But what Hap did, This is a guy who's a graduate of Georgetown Law School. What is he doing for the first 10 years after getting out of school? He's playing basketball. He's playing football. He's playing baseball. He's coaching teams. He was a jock. He didn't even think about building a practice. He was that in love with sports. But he was also making his way in the communities as he's doing that, becoming very friendly. So when you look at the landscape, you see this jock over here, and you see this very distinguished lawyer from Brigantine, and you see this very aggressive, hardworking, bright lawyer in Atlantic City, and it looks like Taggart should be the next boss. So when I would go around to people, and there's about a dozen of them I mentioned in the back of the book, of why was Farley boss, they all gave me the same BS story, but that he was so good with sports and everybody loved him. And I said, that doesn't add up, because that's not going to cut the mustard with somebody like Boyd and somebody like Orman. That's not going to cut it. So, what was the deal? Well, it was a December afternoon, sometime in the 1980s, my friend Paul D'Amato arranged a meeting for me to meet with his uncle, Skinny D'Amato, who owned the 500 Club. I went to Skinny to talk to him about the 500 Club. I didn't go to him to talk about the transition from Johnson to Farley because, stupid me, I thought he knew nothing about it. So in the middle of the conversation, and I can't remember exactly how, you get a picture of Skinny D'Amato. It's 5:30 in the afternoon. It is dark outside. He's sitting in his bed in pajamas. His breakfast tray is at the foot of the bed. He has just gotten, he really was, his circadian rhythm was, he was awake at night and slept during the day. So I'm interviewing him about the demise of the 500 Club, and somehow, because we had to talk about his conviction of white slave. He was a convicted felon too for prostitution, and he started talking about the fact that he would get boys for Tommy Taggart. And my head was about to explode. And I said to him, "What are you saying to me?" He said, "Come on, the guy was queer." He said, "He was a hell of a politician. But, I used to fix him up with young boys." So, needless to say, that conversation had to be pursued. And once I nailed him down on what he was saying, I then went back to all the other people who had BS'd me. And the first words out of their mouth when I would confront them about Taggart's homosexuality, and that was the reason why he didn't become boss, the first words out of their mouth was, "Who told you that?" And when I would tell them Skinny D'Amato, this, "All right," and then they would give me the details. Okay, so I got BS by a lot of people, and that went on for about a year and a half. And so that was the biggest shock, that so many people would BS me. But I guess for them it was a big thing to BS me about, But so that's in the book, and that was probably the biggest surprise that I had.
Talk about authenticating information. Skinny D'Amato is pretty.
Oh, he's a character.
Reliability
He
there.
was a character.
So were there any unanticipated consequences after the book was published for you personally, or?
Yeah, I thought it was going to be a movie. I didn't think it was going to be a TV series. I never dreamt it would be a TV series. See, I always thought if you look at the first half of the 20th century and you look at corrupt cities, you'll have a sphere of influence or a ring of power of politicians, and you'll have a sphere of influence and a ring of power of corrupt racketeers, and they bang into each other and they make friends with each other. But what made Atlantic City special was they became one. Nucky Johnson truly was a very powerful politician and a very powerful racketeer. Herman Orman, Jimmy Boyd, they were politicians and racketeers, and it was right on down the line. So that fascinated me, that the two rings of power became one. Nucky wore two hats the way nobody I know wore two hats. So that fascinated me, and that really pushed me to want to see if I could get somebody interested. And so in taking those two chapters and turning it into a movie, and I had the good fortune of my daughter was living in LA, my nephew was living in LA. I love LA, but I will not drive in LA. And they would pick me up at the airport, and I would spend the weekend going to pitch sessions. And came across a guy who was very interested in it, and gave it to somebody else, and then we got a phone call. So.
So I will end questions with asking you a question. What one question would you ask Nucky Johnson if you had the chance to today?
Well, there's many, but my problem is I don't know if he'd tell me the truth. I'm serious. He really was the classic BS artist. What would I ask him if he was alive today? I don't know. I mean, I'd be curious to know more about his childhood, in terms of what his relationship was like with his father, Smith Johnson. I mean, there was many stories about all the women that he had, but I mean, so what? I'd be curious to see how he used. He believe it or not, he was clerk of when. Well, no, I'll tell you the one. I wish he would give me the answer, but I don't know if he'd give me a straight answer or not. It's a good question. Any of you been to ACC's campus? Walter Edge Auditorium? Okay, Walter Edge clearly was the most accomplished person to come out of Atlantic County. No question about that. He was elected governor twice. He was elected United States Senator twice. He was ambassador to France. I mean, this is a hitter. This is a real hitter, okay? But his first election to office, coming out of Atlantic County, was in 1916. And I don't have any doubt that the reason he was able to beat Austin Colgate in the primary was because Frank Hague's people in Hudson County became. Frank Hague was this amazing force in Hudson County politics, mayor of Jersey City for 30 years, clearly during his prime, the most powerful person in the state. And when he saw a Republican that he was worried about, he kicked their ass in the primary by sending his people to vote into the primary for somebody else. That particular year, he was concerned about the powerful Democrat, a guy by the name of Otto Whitpen, who was a very successful grocer. And he was concerned, that's the Democrat, and he was concerned about Austin Colgate. Colgate, you know, the guy that founded Colgate toothpaste, all his money. He was concerned about either one of them becoming governor. So he really was, you know, in a bad situation. So Nucky understood that. Nucky made a deal on behalf of Edge to get Democrats in Hudson County to vote in the Republican primary and make Edge the candidate. And then Whitpen, they abandoned him when it got to the general election. So I would like to know the details of just how much Edge, because once Edge became governor, he completely ignored Atlantic City and went off to, I think he wound up, you know, I think the governor's mansion even then was in Princeton, but he wound up living in Mercer County, and then I think he had a home in Somerset County, but he never came back to Atlantic City, and he really treated Atlantic City like, you know, it's a dirty place. But he could never have been elected governor for the first time without Nucky Johnson. So I would like to talk to Nucky about that. And he might be honest about that too.
The third book, The Edge.
He's an interesting. If you read his memoirs, you can just take a knife and cut through the BS. I mean, it's amazing.
I could relate to that.
So this is the portion where it's your question. Try to, you can either use the cards that Molly provided you in the back and pass them forward, and she'll be happy to read them. Or, you know, it's a small enough living room here today. If you'd like to just stand up and ask your question, this is your moment.
Yes, I see your hand.
For the show, why do you think they changed his last name from Johnson to Thompson? Do you think it's an accurate description of the natural, like close portrayal as to what he was?
I have become friendly with Terence Winter. He's a real fine person. But the first time I met him, he said to me, "I really like your book, but it will not fill up 12 hours of TV or 24 hours of TV or 36 hours of TV, now 48 hours of TV." So he said, "We want the freedom to simply do what we want to do. We're going to call this guy Nucky Thompson so that everybody realizes he's our fictional character." And he gave lots of interviews telling people that his Nucky was 80% my Nucky, the real Nucky, and 20% his Nucky. That may have been true for the first year, but after that. Not even close. But you live with that. You know.
I have a question. Are you happy about the way your book is portrayed in the show? And do you have any influence on?
Every now and then they will call me to ask me an historical legal question, so that they never want to look stupid to anybody, and so they are conscientious about, if they say things that clearly are fictional, that they are within the realm of possibility, and if they say things stating them sort of like this is a fact, then they want to make sure they got their facts right. I mean, the best illustration I can give you is when Nucky was indicted for election fraud. They originally had written it that he was going to be indicted by the federal U.S. Attorney's Office for election fraud. Well, in the 1920s, the U.S. Attorney's Office had no power to deal with state elections. So I had to explain that to them, and that's how they changed it to a local indictment, and then they got it into the federal court through the prostitutes. Okay. But yeah, my input is tiny on things where they're troubled about historical legal questions. But I have compartmentalized my brain. I read all the scripts in advance, which makes it easier for me to watch the show. And I have a lot of respect for it. He has a very good, solid writing team. They're good people. They're gonna go in places that the real Nucky had nothing to do with this year, and God bless them. You know, it is what it is.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I sold industrial insurance down in the north side for about 3 months back in the early 60s.
Is that me?
One of the things,
Can you just get Justin back in there?
and it was a pretty interesting thing, but one of the things I noticed is that everybody was a numbers runner practically. Numbers ran everything. I think
African Americans,
numbers and maybe prostitution, the whole town.
African Americans brought the numbers to Atlantic City.
I didn't get paid sometimes unless the horses came in.
Okay. I believe you. Yeah,
So I lasted about 3 months.
the numbers game was introduced
It
to
was
Atlantic
real big,
City.
and it wasn't just in the black neighborhood.
No, it was the whole town.
Uptown, everywhere. And that's the little guy buying a little number.
Correct.
So the whole town was corrupt.
No,
All the
absolutely.
way to the bottom.
Well, Dick Jackson said when you went to the grocery store
Yeah.
and you would buy something, they would ask you, did you want change or did you want to buy a number?
You didn't have
Play a lottery.
Candy stores, a lot of cigar stores that
Yeah,
made money.
Yeah, there were over 700 businesses that signed affidavits admitting that they sold the numbers with the understanding they wouldn't be prosecuted.
And
That
it
gives
was
you-
all illegal stuff, legal gambling.
That gives you an idea. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Atlantic County now is an executive form of government, which is different than freehold that existed at the time. What permitted that? What triggered that? And what's puzzles me is how-
When you see, trigger permitted that. That's a pronoun. What do you? What did the corruption?
What enabled it to change from that form of government? What enabled
The old form?
the old form existed,
Right.
and then it changed to an executive form. And at the time that it changed, I think a Democrat was actually the first county executive.
I was on the board of freeholders then.
All right. What caused it? What allowed that to occur?
Farley getting defeated in 1971, and if I were to name one person, and it would be unfair to do that, but if I were to name one person who really pushed the idea that we got to change this form of government for the county, I would say Darrell Todd. And Darrell Todd was a young lawyer in Linwood. He had allies in Roger Steedle. He had allies in a professor from Stockton, Robert Huey, who was the first county administrator. But now you're really testing my memory in terms of. I was finishing up law school while that whole effort was going on, and in 1974, which was the year that I graduated, it was approved at a referendum to change the form of government. And I can remember saying to my mother and my wife, I'm getting in this. And so I ran for freeholder in 1975 and got elected because I was excited about being part of taking the old form of government and transforming it into the new form of government. And myself, Bill Gormley, and Darrell Todd, the three of us were the three lawyers on the Board of Freeholders. And there was one other Democrat, Lillian Bryant, and we had Chuck Worthington, who was a Democrat. And I pride myself, and the two of them will agree, if Bill, Darrell, and I agreed, it happened. Because I had the fourth vote, and one of them could always get the fifth vote. And so if the three of us could agree, we made it happen. And Chuck Worthington was an excellent, well, the campus in Atlantic City is named after Chuck. And Chuck was an amazing county executive, tough-nosed SOB that really would fight. And when I say fight, I mean wasn't backing down for anybody. This was his personal philosophy. Good government is good politics. I don't want to know about, giving out bennies and patronage and taking care of people. I want to do what's right, and he really did live that. And I really respected him. And his first administrator really raised the hackles of the Republicans because you're not as intellectual, Bob Huey. But Bob Huey was a lot more than an intellectual, despite the fact that he was a professor. He went on to become commissioner of DEP. Now he's semi-retired. Bob's a great guy.
And Bob's successor was also a Stockton.
Herb Simmons.
Herb Simmons, yes.
Sokol, did you want to answer?
Can I?
Sokol.
Now you're a creator and you're a judge also. How the judge affect the writer or vice versa? Because, in one way I think it helps because you're used to be objective. But on the other way, you're writing about corruption.
I have two separate lives. Okay? What I do as a judge, I enjoy enormously. I am Nelson C. Johnson, Judge of Superior Court. This book says Nelson Johnson. I don't use the C. I've always made the law and history separate. But my legal training forces me when I am interviewing somebody, when I'm researching something, when I'm documenting something, my legal training forces me to think about the burden of proof. And there's three burdens of proof. One is beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the criminal burden of proof. The other one is the civil burden, which is by a preponderance of the evidence. And then in between the two is clear and convincing. And so when I am writing, I strive to get to clear and convincing or beyond the reasonable doubt. I can't accept by a preponderance of the evidence.
The reason I ask you that question is because I did read your book. I didn't read the Farley book, but I read on the back of the book that I believe is protecting Nucky and
Protecting? I didn't protect Nucky.
not you. Farley.
Oh, fuck. Go ahead.
He wrote the book, The Real Nucky Johnson, whatever, and he was his lawyer, so that's why, come in my mind that, like the judge, the lawyer, and the writer.
Well, I was a judge after I wrote the book.
Couple more thoughts? Over here, sir?
Dave?
Hi, Nelson. I was wondering, you spoke about some of the challenges and maybe a little bit of the circuitous route that you were forced to follow when you were researching Boardwalk Empire. When you turned your attention to writing the book, The North Side, did you run into similar challenges in interviewing people for the book?
The answer is honestly no. And why is twofold. One, I had the first book published. And a little bit of backstory on the first book was the chapter 3, and you and I may have had this conversation. Is this a softball pitch?
No.
Dave and I are friendly. So, chapter 3 of this book is in. Mr. McGinty, how are you? Did you just walk in? Ah, all right. How's Ed? Good. Good seeing you. Chapter 3 is entitled Plantation by the Sea. And I want to say it was around 1995 and then again in 1996. I put the book down because I was so frustrated with how that chapter read. And I said to myself, if you can't do it honestly, then there's no point in doing it at all. And I got disgusted and lost a fair amount of time because of that. I made up my mind somewhere like around 1998, 1999, that I had to get that chapter written. And the first two people that I took it to were my friends, James Jackson, who's a Superior Court judge sitting in the family division, but he and I practiced law together back in the early 80s when I was representing the planning board. He and I had an office together in Atlantic City. And then I also took it to my dear friend Radinia Gilliam-Mose, who was an executive at Bally's. They both were class of 66 in Atlantic City. I'm class of 66 along with another person, class of 66. Here, Carol. You're not admitting to that? And I took the book to the two. Took that chapter to the two of them. Jim is a man of very few words. He's one of the wisest people that I know. And when he and I sat down, his response to me concerning the chapter was, he went like this: "You put your thumb right on it," and that was his reply. And he didn't say a whole lot more than that, but I knew what he meant. Radinia was a different ball game completely. She was effusive. She loved it, and she said, "Now you know you must write a second book." And I said, "Yes, Radinia, I do know that." So as soon as I finished this book, I did start the research for the second book, but it was easier to do the second book than the first, because I had people like Radinia and Jim opening doors for me, because they had helped me with this, and because there were people that wanted to talk, because they realized they're dying and they want to talk to me. I mean, fortunately, a couple of the people that were really helpful, they're still alive, and I'm thrilled about that. But it was easier, the second one. It was easier. And the book I'm working on now, everybody's dead, so so I have nobody to talk to.
Question over here, Nelson.
I found it interesting how the political machine had a sense of benevolence. The political machine had an obligation and responsibility to help take care of those that were less fortunate.
It did, but there was a quid pro quo, too.
Was it for the vote only?
Yes, for the vote and loyalty. She found it interesting that the political organization had a benevolent side to it of looking after people. And I said there was a quid pro quo, which is that you must vote for the organization and be loyal for the organization. And some people, let's be candid about it, had to vote more than once for the organization. I mean, the best illustration I can give you of that is when the Commodore Lewis Coonley went to jail. That was Woodrow Wilson's campaign in 1910. He ran for governor, and his father, grandfather, and uncle were teetotaling Presbyterian ministers, and he was a teetotaler. And so the Commodore said, "This guy's a real threat to our economy." And needless to say, Wilson won. But when they checked the election results, they saw that Wilson's opponent, a guy by the name of Lewis, had more votes than there were registered voters. So that was a huge problem. But that carried right on into the 60s. That they would colonize votes, that they would get people to vote. You could vote for dead people, vote for people that were away, and vote for people that were fictitious characters. That went on for a long time. The form of voter fraud that occurs in Atlantic City today, I think they've done a pretty good job of beating it down. But for several years there, you had absentee ballots. That was the form it was taking, and they were pretty good at it too. Those two brothers really had worked up a pretty good organization at that. But yes, the organization was benevolent because they had to be. There were no social service agencies.
Back here, Nelson. Back row.
Yes, sir.
In your opinion, the season 1 versus season 4, what is closer to reality? I remember season 1, there was more sex and nudity. Today, it's like the violence has increased dramatically. In your opinion, what is is the reality? Closer to season 1 or season 4? It's really changed a lot.
Much closer season 1. And the violence, I had this conversation with Terence Winter, and he just shrugged his shoulders and laughed, smiled. I believe real power is not having to get violent. Real power is getting your way because of who you are, and people don't want to mess with you. When you have to resort to violence, then you're not so powerful. And the best illustration, and this was frustrating as hell. After I wrote this book, people came out of the woodwork wanting to tell me stories. And one of the best stories that I got, and I should remember her name, and I may have it written down someplace. It was an Italian surname. She was a tiny little woman, had to be close to 80 at the time. And this, I was speaking at the Brigantine Elks Club. You know, I think it was like 2003, 2004, and she told me a story of growing up in Ducktown and her father owning a laundry, and her father having done something to offend Johnson. She didn't know the details because she was a kid, but he did something to offend Johnson. And over time, people stopped coming to the laundry. They came to pick things up, and they didn't take anything back. And as business really started dwindling, her father had to go to Johnson and say, you know, what are we doing here? And he had to make up with them. That's real power. Real power is being able to get everybody in the community to side with you on your problem, whether it's circling the wagons and not testifying, when the FBI comes to town, or whether it's informally blacklisting somebody. They can't get a job. They can't get customers. I mean, that's real power. So having to use the guns and the clubs, that wasn't Johnson's style at all. He did not get violent.
Was there any one significant thing that through history that made Atlantic City go to a mayor, council, government, or was it just a
Well, they started out at mayor council. No, started out at city council, went to mayor council, went back to city commission, and now at mayor council. It's been 4 different permutations. I think each time they made the move, they thought there was going to be more accountability. Now you have a strong mayor form of government. They thought that was more accountability. When you had a weak mayor and a strong council, they went to a city commission because they thought the city commissioners would be more accountable. I mean, form of government really, I don't think form of government means anything. I really don't. The county executive is a good example where it did make a difference. So I'm probably over speaking there. But I mean, it's the custom practices, the mores, the traditions of people, of how you do things and get them done that matter more than the form, But county executive is a good example. Yes, sir.
What lingering effects, if any, do you think that era had today in this area? What lingering effect, any effect of that era, or way brutality, any of that?
Well, today it's a huge effect. Come on. Nuckys Legacy. He's got a tangible legacy, and he's got an intangible, more powerful legacy. His tangible legacy is Boardwalk Hall, because Boardwalk Hall would never have been built without him. Boardwalk Hall would never have been built without Prohibition. And Boardwalk Hall, for those of you who don't know it, Boardwalk Hall is on a dollar per seat basis, Boardwalk Hall is one of the most successful arenas in the United States. And probably the key to Atlantic City's future is special events, not gambling, to really make the town hum with entertainment, with all sorts of entertainment, whether it's rodeos or Miss America or James Taylor or whomever. You bring the sing and do whatever. But his intangible, more powerful legacy is a town that never developed the traditional means for the exercise and the transfer of power. That's what I experienced when I went to City Hall in the 80s. What I experienced was everybody thinking they're going to be the next boss. And so what you have is intrigue, conniving, hidden agendas, squabbling, brawls. I talked to a retired FBI agent in connection with the second book. He was a person who had investigated Carlos Lassane. And what he said to me was two things. He said, first, the corruption's just built into the fabric of the town. He agreed with me that was Nuckys' true legacy. He thought Carlos was a wonderful human being, and he was naive. He wasn't venal. Like, I think I quote him. I think that's the phrase I use in the book. But the second thing he said, listen, we all know that if we want to go to Atlantic City and investigate, he said, coming away with indictments even today is like shooting fish in a barrel. So Johnson's true legacy is a town that really never learned how to exercise and transfer power in the traditional means of most communities in America. In Atlantic City, the fight never ends. The chance to be the next boss never stops. Not a good thing, not a healthy thing for the town. Yes?
I'm a creative writing major here at Stockton, and I was wondering, you said that you had some issues getting through a chapter, and I was wondering what kind of advice you can give to me as an aspiring writer on how to get through the struggles of writing a whole book.
Well, an outline's important. It is for me. And sometimes, depending upon the issue, the outline's more detailed. Some things you've researched them so carefully, or you've thought them through so carefully that you know what you want to say, and you just say it. Other things, it gets so intricate that you really do need to detail it in an outline, almost sentence by sentence. But let me give you this tip. The most important influence in my life was my mother. And one of the things that I learned from her, and it's now a guide to me in writing, and I think I discussed this with my friend Dave. When the King James Version of the Bible was written, it was written for an audience that by and large didn't read. And so the editing took place through speaking the words. That's how the editing occurred. And the better your writing speaks, the better it reads. And so every now and then my wife will walk in and think I'm crazy, but I'll be sitting in the sun porch and I'm reading a chapter out loud, and I'll stop and say, shit, that sentence doesn't read well at all, and I know that I have to rewrite it. So I think a guide to good writing is, does it read well? Does it read well aloud? And I had to explain that to my next book's going to be published by Rutgers, and I had to explain that to my publisher, because one of the things I said to her in an email was, not all the sections pass the readability portion, as in read aloud. And she's, what are you talking about, read aloud? And I had to explain to her. So it's a tip. But how do you get? I've never had the problem of writer's block, because I write history, and I have a problem with sometimes coming up with an outline that gets me to where I want to be. And then I'll tell you the most difficult problem for me, and maybe you can relate to this, are bridge paragraphs, bridge sentences. You have two big thoughts, and they're connected, but the reader's never going to understand they're connected unless you figure out 4, 5, 6 sentences to bridge them together seamlessly. And that's hard. I have spent months on a bridge paragraph. It's in my brain and just stays there, and I write it down every now and then and just work at it till you get it. But do what my friend Dave does, and I don't do it as religiously as he does. Carry around a little booklet and write down someone may say something that's really a neat phrase. You may read something that's really a catchy phrase. You may hear something on the radio that's really a catchy phrase. Write it down so you don't forget it. That can be helpful. I'm not sure if it'll help or not.
I can say as a historian, we do frequently get writer's block. He may not, but many of us do. And I teach it at Stockton. Many of my sources are earlier. I focus on the 16th and 17th and early 18th century. So that measure of beyond a shadow of a doubt is something I can't actually apply to my own work, because there are many shadows and there are many doubts when you're dealing with centuries
Well, yeah,
ago.
but you got to make the reader know that too.
Indeed.
Oh, okay.
So, but here's my question. My question is, can you give us an example or two of something that didn't pass your test, and so didn't make it into the book?
That's good. That's good. There were some stories about Johnson that I thought were BS. Different investments that he supposedly made, different women that he supposedly bed down, you know, actresses and stuff. None of that's in the book because it just sounded like BS to me. I mean, you know, and I'm not sure how I would go about trying to prove it.
Was there anything that you really wanted to have go in the book, but you just couldn't? Because there are times, there's moments, I'm working on a problem, and you want to make it work, right? You want this to be an argument you can make.
I'm
but
having-
the source material doesn't allow you.
Well, guess what? I just went through that this summer and was almost, it was like my wife and I built a new house and moved in May. And in April, I had a panic attack because a particular chapter that I was working on was wrong. The pivotal event in the chapter was wrong. And I had it in my brain for years, and I was wrong. So I had to really suck it up and figure out how I was going to do it differently. A fire that never took place. And I needed the fire to tell that portion of the story. So I just had to forget it and figure out, all right, how do I do this? But it was in a place that I had to figure out how do I get the two together. So I know what you're talking about. It's not easy sometimes, but it's fun too at the same time because it's a challenge. Stimulates the gray matter. Yes, sir.
Did you find anywhere when you were doing your research where Nucky actually used strong arm tactics?
No.
He just had so much power. Like,
Mr. McGinney, what do you think? Did Nucky ever get tough at anybody? He didn't have to. I mean, he could bully and intimidate, but I don't know of anybody getting beat up.
So this guy knew it.
You knew Nuck.
So they didn't have to have enforcers type people or anything.
See, when you have the whole community behind you,
Right.
you don't need it.
Right.
Because there's all sorts of ways of dealing with people who don't get into line. I mean, they might mess with your tax assessment. You might go to work and find you're out of a job. You might open up your business and find out your regulars aren't coming. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to deal with renegades.
Later on, like Stumpy Werman, did he use strong arm tactics? Because he ran a lot of pretty shady things.
I don't think he would get the police to do it for him, but even then, it was more about citations than it was about getting physical. Yeah, it was more about citation than it was getting physical.
Can I ask another question? You spoke about how surprising it was that Hap moved to power. You eliminated one of the two heir apparents. How is it, did you ever come to a conclusion about how Hap Farley did come to power?
Well, no. I'll tell you how he came to power. Because they knocked Taggart out because he was homosexual, and it was okay for him to be assemblyman. It was okay for him to be state senator. It was okay for him to be mayor because having those titles didn't make you powerful. It was the head of the organization that had the power. So he almost died of like nervous frustration because once he realized he wasn't going to get what he wanted, he really became trouble for himself and everybody else. What was he, 52, 53 when he died? Taggart? Two-gun Tommy. He was young. And Hahnemann really loved the law more than he loved politics. And Hap knew that. So Hap said to him, listen, if you make me boss, I'll make you a judge. And he not only became a judge, he became the first and only Supreme Court justice from Atlantic County. Now, there was another Supreme Court justice under the old Supreme Court prior to the 1947 Constitution. That was Joseph Persky. Steve Persky's grandfather. But under the modern Supreme Court, there's only been one person, and that was Vincent Hahnemann, who was the assemblyman from Brigantine, who the bridge is named after, and who was one of the really great intellectuals and great, talk about a raconteur, talk about being able to tell stories. He was an amazing guy. But when I met him, I wasn't interested in doing the book. And when I met him, he talked about his time on the bench and interacting with lawyers, and that was terrific, just listening to him, you know. So Farley was able to get the two most likely people out of the way. And then another person who was powerful because he was a great glad-hander, but he really didn't want power, was Joe Altman. So he got Altman to back him. He got Orman to back him. I think his deal with Boyd was, you know, you run the county, and you run the patronage in City Hall, and let me go to Trent. Because Farley really did want to be a legislator, and he was a very good legislator too. Because I interviewed people who he served with, and they had tremendous respect for him. Trying to remember the name of the senator from Hunterdon County. Wade. Anyway, he got tearful talking about Farley. Yeah, he admired him enormously. He really liked him. Well, I have enjoyed myself enormously.
Thank you. Around